In this lesson, you will be given an isosceles triangle or a equilateral triangle, and you will be given one angle measure, and you'll have to figure out the remaining angle measures. So the objective here is, given an isosceles triangle and one angle measure, the learner, which is you, will be able to calculate the other two angles. So first, let's talk about what an isosceles triangle and an equilateral triangle are. So the first thing to know about an isosceles triangle is that they have two congruent sides, and two congruent angles. Alright, so here what I have, the congruent sides are marked. These are actually called your legs. I guess it would be a leg. Alright, the bottom, if you think of like the bottom of a house or anything that you build, the bottom side is called a base. Kind of like you build your house maybe on a basement or the baseboards. The bottom, the top angle is called the vertex angle. Alright, and then here we have our two base angles. These are called your base angles. So another important part to note is that your two legs are congruent. Those are my two congruent sides, and my two base angles are congruent. Those are my two congruent angles. That's an isosceles triangle. An equilateral triangle has three congruent sides and three congruent, keep writing pi, three congruent angles. What I know is that because these sides are marked right here, that tells me it's an equilateral triangle, meaning that all three sides are the same. And I can easily figure out what the angles of an equilateral triangle are because they're all the same and they add up to 180. So if I have 180 total degrees inside this triangle and I divide it amongst three angles equally, that would be 180 degrees divided by 3, 60 degrees. So each angle inside an equilateral triangle will be 60 degrees always. The sides might be different measures, but it would be the same side. So it would be maybe 6, 6, 6, or 8, 8, 8, 10.5, 10.5, 10.5. The sides will always be the same, but the angles will always be 60. So let's solve some triangles here. Inside this isosceles triangle right here, I know it's isosceles because I have two congruent sides. And when I have the two congruent sides, the two angles that are opposite the congruent sides are my base angles. So I know that this is 46 degrees, and x would also be 46 degrees. Now how do we figure out y? I know that all angles inside of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. So I know that 46 plus 46 plus whatever y is equals 180. If I add my two numbers together over here on the left side of the equal sign, 46 and 46 is 92, plus y equals 180. Alright, now I subtract 92 from both sides, and 180 minus 92 is 88. So y is 88 degrees. Alright, looking at the next triangle. Again, I know it's isosceles because it has two marked angles. What I do know is if you tip this sideways right here, the 40 degrees is actually my vertex angle. I know that because these two right here across from my congruent sides are my base angles. So let's work a little bit backwards here. I know that all these angles must add up to 180 degrees, first thing. The second thing I know is that since these are both the base angles, they are the same exact angle measure. So if I figure out what 180 minus 40 is, that's 140 degrees. So now I have 140 degrees left to use amongst two angles. Remember, these two angles are exactly the same measure. So if x and y are the same measure, and they add up to 140 degrees, all I'm doing is splitting 140 degrees into two angles. So the next thing I do is 140 divided by 2 is 70 degrees. So in this case, x is 70 and y is 70. They're both the same, they're congruent because they're base angles. Let's look at the next example. So again, tipping the side triangle sideways, x is my vertex angle, and 63 and y are my base angles. I know that because they're across from my congruent sides. So when I have base angles, they're the exact same measure. So 63 and y are congruent. So y equals 63 degrees. Why? Because it's congruent. Alright, now I need to figure out what x is. I know that the three angles inside of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. So if I say 63 plus y equals 180, I can solve that. Again, it's like the last unit where we were solving for a missing third angle inside of a triangle. So I add 63 and 63, that gives me 126, plus y equals 180. Now I just simply subtract 126 from both sides. Whoops. So 180 minus 126. Oh, that's bad. 180 minus 126. Let's do that. That gives me 54 degrees. So again, angle, oh, that's not x. Oh, I made a big mistake. In this one, we're solving for x, not y. So my mistake, let's fix this to x here. My mistake, x equals 54 degrees. It's supposed to be a degree mark there. Alright. Now, tricky here. I have a giant isosceles triangle. If you look, you see a giant isosceles triangle that is actually split into two smaller triangles. Let's use a little bit of logic, what we learned in this chapter. So I have a side and an angle, and what I know is that these are triangles that are touching each other. They share a side, which means they are congruent by the rule side, angle, side. Now we'll take this one step further. If I know this is congruent by side, angle, side, that means this triangle is congruent to this triangle, which means every piece over here is congruent with the corresponding piece over here. So I would have these three sides are congruent to these three sides, and these three angles are also congruent to these three angles. So if I want to know what x is, it simply equals the corresponding side from the other angle, which is 4. That one does not get a degree mark because it's not a degree, it's a side length. Alright, the next we have to work a little bit backwards here. So I know that this angle and this angle are base angles because they're across from my legs. So this angle must be 65 degrees. To find the third angle inside of this triangle, I have to add 65 plus my number equals 180. Alright, if I add 65 and 65, that's 130, plus my missing angle equals 180. To solve my missing angle, I subtract 130 from both sides. 180 minus 130 gets me 50 degrees. Alright, we still haven't got our answer because we're still looking for x down here. So let's do a little bit of logic. We know that since this is 50 degrees, this one must also be 50 degrees because of vertical angles. Alright, further, we still haven't got to the x yet. What I do know is that this angle and this angle are base angles because they're across from my legs, the congruent legs. So if this angle is 50, and this angle must also be 50 degrees. And again, I still haven't got to my x, I still have to get to this x over here. So what do I know? I know that three angles inside of a triangle add to 180 degrees. So I can say that 50 plus whatever my x is has to equal 180. If I add together 50 and 50, that's 100 plus our unknown x equals 180 degrees. Then I simply take away 100 from both sides, and x equals 80 degrees. So we've solved for x now. X is 80 degrees. Took us a little bit of work to get there, but we certainly did. Alright. In our next example, again, I have to get over here to x, but I have to do a little bit of logic. So let's think this through. So I eventually want to get over here. So the question is, I want to get a number that's inside this triangle so I can figure out this one. I don't necessarily care about these other angles over here unless I need to work with them. What I do notice is that this angle is 28 degrees, and I see this right angle marking in here, which tells me that this whole angle right here is 90 degrees. So if I know that these two angles together, this one and this one, make 90 degrees, I can figure out this angle right here by subtracting 28 from 90. So let's do that. 90 minus 28. And that's going to get me 62 degrees. Okay, now we've started the process here. We have one of these angles inside of the angle with, or inside of the triangle with the x. What do we know now? We know this angle across from the leg is a base angle, and this angle, our 62 degrees, is also a base angle. And since we know base angles are congruent, this angle over here would also be 62 degrees. We still haven't found x yet, so we need to do a little bit more work. What I do know is that these three angles add up to 180 degrees because they're a triangle. So I would say 62 plus x equals 180. When I add 62 and 62, that gives me 124 plus x equals 180. I subtract 124 from both sides, and my x equals whatever 180 minus 124 is. That gives me 56 degrees. So x equals 56 degrees. We have solved for x. Again, you might have to do a little detective work and figure out, use your clues to figure out what other angles are, like use vertical angles, use right angles, and all that sort of thing. Alright, now your turn to practice.